It's really an honor and a pleasure to be able to introduce Andrew Nessamore today, whose work I've admired for a very long time. And we actually overlapped at University of Texas at Austin, where I was teaching previously and where he got his PhD. And now we both get to teach at the same university. So it's really exciting to be able to introduce him. So Drew received his BA in sociology from the University of Texas at Austin in 2015, his MA in social sciences from the University of Chicago in 2016, and then got a PhD in sociology from the University of Texas at Austin, again in 2024, and then joined the sociology faculty here at UW last a year and a half ago, 2024. And he is also a faculty affiliate at the eScience Institute, also a faculty affiliate here at CSDE, and also at the Center for Statistics and Social Sciences. And so his research is broadly concerned with the dynamics of housing systems in the United States, which is so important today, especially. He asks how land ownership, housing investment, and property usage evolve over time. And he investigates what the consequences of these dynamics are for housing affordability, urban inequality, and contemporary cities more generally. And currently, his research is focused on the development of new data and novel computational tools for mapping the shifting landscape of land ownership, which we'll hear about today, and the development of theoretical frameworks for understanding how and why rental landlord ownership evolves. And I just find this work so important. I know that there's new research being done here in Seattle and King County more broadly, which is so exciting because so few of us understand actually how property and land is actually working in the day-to-day. Very few of us know who our landlords are or who owns most of the properties that we go in and out of. And so this type of research is so crucial and so difficult, as I've come to find out through trying to do some of it myself. It's not easy. And so all that he's going to be sharing with you today is so important for us all to learn about. So thank you so much for your research and for your talk today.
Well, howdy, y'all. How's it going? It's an honor to be here at the CSDEU today. This research was started almost 5 years ago now in the depths of the COVID-19 pandemic. This was my isolation project. Some people baked bread. Some people were playing video games. I was trying to figure out landlords. We all did something. And it's amazing now to have the opportunity to share this work with such a wide and wonderful community here at UW. So thanks also to the many folks who made this possible, to, of course, Juan for organizing this series and doing all of the work of bringing all these people together in this wonderful community that we have. These communities are extremely important, particularly in times like right now. So thank you, Juan. And thank you also, of course, Aaron, for that really wonderful introduction. I've been following your work for, again, a number of years now, and our work has looked at the same problems from these different angles. And it's just really a highlight of my career to be in conversation with you now in this space as we work through all of these problems. So thank you again for the introduction. And of course, thank you everyone who helped actually put together the mechanics and plumbing of this talk today at CSDE. It wouldn't be possible without you too. So thank you for that. All right, so an overview of the talk. Problem, approach, analysis, implications. Generally speaking, the problem we're talking about is the rise of corporate landlords. There's concern that there's some sort of corporate takeover in ownership and land, resulting in changes in the way that land is owned, that small landlords are not as important in the distribution of ownership anymore. I'm going to be introducing an approach I've developed for kind of understanding land ownership by mixing some data together, cleaning it, harmonizing it, and so on, to try to de-anonymize ownership. I'm then going to walk through an empirical analysis I did that comes from my dissertation work done during COVID of ownership in Austin, Texas, after the Great Recession for the decade that followed, and then walking through some of the implications for trends and policy if I have some time. So here's the problem in a nutshell. It is increasingly unclear who owns land. It's more and more difficult to figure this out. Our environment is becoming more and more dark, more and more opaque. And it's especially true of rental property. In the context of this darkness and opacity, One theory is that single-family rental housing is transforming into corporate ownership by institutional investors. Institutional investors could be large-scale banks, it could be Blackstone, Invitation Homes, and so on, large firms, typically associated with Wall Street. At the same time, there's thought to be this displacement of the small, right? The mom and pop, the traditional, the old school investor who used to be the dominant actor. And many jurisdictions are now experimenting with regulations on investment based on landlord size or scale, trying to limit investment by large actors because of their impacts on the housing supply. SB 5496 is the law being considered here in Washington State. The Trump administration is also now pursuing this issue as of 2 days ago. So we are now in this environment where there's a lot of concern in a bipartisan sense across the board about ownership. Big takeaways from the talk. I think that this problem is greatly overstated. I think that the growth of corporate ownership in SFR housing, at least in the way we're thinking about corporatization, there's not a lot of evidence that it's occurring in the way that this problem is thought of. When we actually look at the level of regional housing systems over time, we're actually seeing a great deal of stability among mom and pop owners. However, we are experiencing increasing darkness. Ownership structures are becoming more complex. More investment vehicles are being used. People are joining together to form new kinds of ways of owning property. And all of this evolution among ownership is creating a very opaque environment, which I think will actually undermine scale-based regulation for both small and large owners. And I think theoretically, that means that we need to focus less on taxonomies. Good landlords, bad landlords, small landlords, big landlords, corporate landlords, mom and pops. We need to move away from that and think about instead evolution of land ownership in general within housing systems. Okay, so let's begin first of all with the problem, to walk through that a little bit. The problem, of course, is terra incognita, land that is not known. One of the first acts of any capitalist society is to map the land. There be dragons at the edges of the map, right? Or here, as in this map of early colonial America, the land of the raging wildlands, right? At the edges of our understanding, you can't colonize something. You can't dominate it. You can't render it legible. You can't render it taxable. You can't have incorporation. You have to map the land to make things transferable and understandable. And so any kind of capitalist society has to do this, right? This is what was very important in the transition from feudalism to capitalism in the 19th century, right? One of the very first acts of the Napoleonic Code, Napoleon's Revolution, was the cadastre, actually mapping ownership of who owned land in order to tax individuals and make them residents of a newly kind of formed society. This was the move away from feudalism, right? Where tribute was given from serfs to kings, landowners, lords, who then paid on to the state. Now everyone is taxed directly through the ownership system, creating what Thomas Piketty calls an ownership society. It is the basis of capitalist incorporation. And so seeing the land is essential to how we organize these societies for political inclusion, for taxation and fiscal regimes, and also monetary systems, right? Some of the earliest modern financial institutions, such as the Massachusetts Land Bank, were based on land. They had land-based assets, and that persists nowadays to mortgage-based securities and so on, right? Mapping the land is essential. We have to see it. And this, of course, persists into the current day through the lowly, humble county tax assessor, right here as we have in King County. These are all the maps of what we have in King County. These little digital things you can find on the internet, all of the different records, right? We continue to map the land through all of these records. Now, here's the problem again. To borrow the phrase from Bruno Latour, you could say that the earth is disappearing right before us. The land itself is disappearing. We don't know who owns this land. Not because we don't have records, but because those records are increasingly unintelligible, because we don't actually know the people who own them. The data that we have from the census shows us that the number of rental properties held by sole proprietors declined from 92% in 1991 to 68% in 2021. So there is a rapid decline in the number of properties that are owned clearly by some person who has a name, who has personhood, and so on. The result of many different transformations, but of course, it's the emergence of this corporate form through which things are owned. Now, in the last 10 years, the way that this has been conceptualized is increasingly through the rise of a corporate landlord, right? There's been a lot of writings about REITs, about private equity firms, about Blackstone, American Invitation for Homes. There's been concern that these companies are buying up properties and turning them into their own rental properties. And because they're in that corporate form, that's what's driving this opacity. So there's been a lot of regulation or attempts at regulation, meetings before the House Committee in the Senate. Jeff Merkley in Oregon proposed a law, and now is increasingly a universal issue across the political spectrum, right? This is a concern for J.D. Vance, a concern for Joe Biden, a concern for Ed Markey, and as of 2 days ago now, it is the policy of the Trump administration as well. From the top to the bottom, there is fear that corporate landlords are now shaping this ownership and driving this opacity. This, of course, is the example of what we're doing here. The law is being considered, where there's been a lot of concern within the county about a loss of our small local mom and pop landlords. And then the state is also trying to bring this in. Just to give you some context, this is also the concern of Greg Abbott, who says the Texas legislature needs to rein in investors by large owners. So it's everywhere, everywhere. Well, okay, what do we know? We do know that there are some things associated with large landlords. They target particular communities. They might price rents higher. They might be more likely to neglect property. But in terms of this actual story of corporate takeover, the data is not very clear what's happening, right? So we do see this trend that there's decline in sole proprietorship, but the big problem is simply that landlords of any size can hide your ownership. You can use an LLC, you can use subsidiaries, you can use partnerships, you can use trusts, you can use a variety of different kinds of legal entities to hold your properties, and you can do so with other people in very complex organizational strategies. So this means we can't take that data for granted. Meanwhile, large owners have existed since the Gilded Age. The studies that have really focused on Wall Street owners, right, who we have the SEC data from, only find about 2 to 4% of single-family homes nationally are owned by these Wall Street owners, and we don't have research that follows complete trends anywhere. So we really are dealing with terra incognita. So that's what we don't know. We don't know the full extent of corporate ownership. We don't know how dynamics are evolving among small owners, and we don't know how to address this anonymity problem. So this is what motivated me 5 years ago during the COVID-19 pandemic to do what I believe at the time was the first longitudinal study of ownership of any city in the US, a study of Austin, Texas. So computational approach, what am I doing? Austin, Texas is the city of the Violet Crown, of course, and also my home. But I think it's actually an ideal case for understanding the behaviors of investors. It's a growing, vibrant, huge boom town. It's a Sunbelt city, which is a core buy for institutional investors who've been operating in the South. It has relatively high land values, so that can also protect smaller investors, meaning they're not really competing with them as large. So you can study both of those dynamics, right? It's important to remember, again, that Austin is somewhat exceptional in its growth. This is showing the number of just apartment buildings permitted per capita. It experienced huge urban densification, a giant construction boom. So it's a boom town. So those dynamics are very relevant for understanding it. But in terms of this problem of sole proprietorship, its dynamics are consistent with national trends. This is census data compared to tax assessor data, looking at sole proprietorship rates. And you see the same downward slopes. A little bit different in terms of the levels, but sole proprietorship is also declining in Austin alongside these national dynamics. Okay, so that being said, how do we analyze this problem? What do we do to go about it? It requires an enormous amount of data collection and analysis, as Brandon Morandi can tell you about, who I've been working with here. It is something where you have to collect a bunch of property tax assessment data, as well as business filings and link them. There's other resources that are possible. I can talk about other approaches using pre-existing data, But this is going to the raw resource and trying to link these records, trying to link the actual assessments, the records of the business filings to figure out who owns what and how the ownership is structured. Now, this is messy data, right? Inherently, we're dealing with opacity, increasing complexity, but it's records that were not meant for researchers. It was meant for tax assessment, which means you have to extensively process it. You have to come up with all sorts of decision rules, algorithms, and so on. What I've developed uses more than 150 different decision criteria across different functions to actually work through this. And you have to extensively harmonize things, right? Addresses have to appear the same way across data. Names have to appear the same way across data. You have to actually do a lot of work to make this legible for any particular project. Now, what it ends up looking like in the case of my research are massive networks. Here's a sample of one section of that network. The total network of Austin, of all of the entities that appear in that data, is a network of 57.6 million relationships among 36.9 million entities, comprising properties, persons, addresses, company names, intermediaries, PO boxes, and so on, all of which were active at some point in that decade. So we are linking tons of information in a hierarchical way across all of that data. How does this work? I'm not going to walk through the entirety of it. That'd be impossible today, but I'll give you the general flow. Basically, we work first through network assembly, right? So we generate hierarchical relationships between a person that appears on that record and the company that they work at. And then we say there's also a relationship between where that property is located and potentially an office that's also located to a we generate sets of rules for linking all of these different kinds of entities in a intelligible format. Then we resolve the people, all the different kinds of ways that names can appear in this record, right? How do you know that two Jane Does or John Smiths are the same person? The technical term here is Markov blankets is what actually is used. But essentially what we do is we link persons that appear to be linked to records that also link similarly, right? So within the neighborhoods of particular records within this network, you can say all of these people seem to be linked to the same thing and they have the same names. So therefore they are the same people. So we iterate across all of these Markov blankets hundreds of thousands of times, and we link through it, right? Every Jane Doe 1, every Jane Doe 2, every John Smith 1, and so on, every Bobby Hill 1, 2, or 3. And so you have to figure out who all those people are. Then we go through the companies once we have the names. We can use organizations, right? Maybe 3 LLCs all have the same board members on a certain record. We can say because they have the same board members, those are the same companies. We can generate amalgams from that. Furthermore, we can directly link companies. Let's say they have the same names themselves, or maybe the data itself says that they're subsidiaries. We have that in Texas to a certain extent. We can do that kind of resolution as well. And then based on an algorithm and the hierarchy of that network, we can track through the network who is the owning entity at the end of a chain. We can follow the chain, we can follow the spider web back to its source. And it's actually possible to work through it in that way. So that being said, what do we find? Is landlord size changing in Austin? The answer generally is no. This is breaking down a decomposition of ownership of all landlords of some different size classes, from smallest to largest. The smallest ones are 1 to 5 at the bottom. The very biggest, the 500 plus unit landlords, are there at the top. About 60% of the market is owned by what we would call relatively large landlords, 100 units or more. We see a trend towards consolidation. There's a movement from the large to the larger, but the small folks are there. They are not disappearing from this market in Austin over time. How does this occur, this consolidation? It's because there's buying of other large landlords by the very largest that are buying other properties and building. So there's consolidation and amalgamation, but it's occurring among these large landlords at the top who are buying each other out, creating larger entities, and are also building properties, right? A lot of these are developers, these very, very large landlords, right? So at the very large, there's a kind of ecosystem among the very large that's somewhat market segmented from the folks who are at the bottom, typically investing in other kinds of property like single family homes, older duplexes, and so on. Okay, no shifts in size, But what about anonymity or complexity? Here is where we actually start to see changes. These are the number of investment vehicles on average by landlord size mentioned in TCAD. And for the first time, you are seeing even relatively small owners, those 4 to 6 landlords, using an LLC or a legal structure to hold their properties. The slightly larger now are using 2 rather than 1 LLC, and so on. The bigger, they're using 5 rather than 2. There is an increasing use of investment vehicles at the level of the register. Now, that's at the level of the TCAD, right? That's what you see on the tax assessment record, the number of individual LLCs. What about the entities that we get from the companies in general? Moving back to the assessor records, when we have this database, what about the number of entities in general associated with these companies that are not just visible on the record? There, you're seeing extreme increases in the complexity of owners, particularly among the very largest. The very largest went from in 2010 to being about 15 different kinds of organizations were used to hold their properties, to now more than 50. So there's a propagation of extraordinarily complex ownership structures among REITs, among investment banks, among other kinds of entities, right? So there's an increasing complexity of ownership within and then at the level of the record. Again, it's all through these LLCs, legal structures, trusts, other kinds of subsidiaries, and bring together all these different forms of ownership. Meanwhile, if we're concerned about single family homes in particular, right, that's the kind of concern of the Trump administration. A lot of it's about homeownership, not necessarily about renters. We can see in Austin that in general, this is all of the properties that are used as rentals as opposed to all properties, right? So we see here that something like 18%, 19% of all homes are being used as rentals. That's gone up a little bit over the last decade, right? There's a move from homeownership to rental. But those properties in general are owned by very, very small investors, right? They haven't been displaced. They're more than 80% of the market. Those homes are still owned by quote unquote mom and pops, amateur investors. That being said, again, those amateur investors are using more different kinds of legal structures that are more complex and opaque to own their properties. So the 2 to 5 unit investors are now using an investment vehicle. The 6 to 10 unit ones are much more likely to use an investment vehicle, and so on, up the size distribution. So there's a lot more use of these different kinds of legal entities, not just sole proprietorship, that's generating this opacity. Now, this creates a question, right? Why and how is this occurring? What is driving this? And this is where I think we need to really start using the language of evolution to think through the movement in the system. And I think that there is 2 general processes or causes. One is adaptation among successive cohorts of investors, and 2 is actually learning and evasion of existing laws that's motivating this shift. So here's a sequence analysis of every year of activity of every single family landlord that was ever active in Austin over that decade, showing you if they were a person, so proprietorship, or a corporation. Person being red, green being corporation, gray means they died. They were no longer active, essentially, right? And what you're seeing is enormous amounts of turnover, actually. Only 38% of owners active in 2010 were active 10 years later. There's an enormous amount of velocity and change among these small owners. And roughly every year, 10% of those new owners each year entered as LLCs. They were going into the market, now not owning as a property, but as a kind of company. So there was a shift in the cohorts as people moved and came out of the market, as people retired, as people left. They were replaced by people who were now using a more formalized ownership structure, which caused adaptation within the population, right? They were using a new form of holding. That's not all of it, though. At the same time, it doesn't account for the entirety of the shift. In 2021, about 25% of incorporated landlords were landlords who had been active previously as a sole proprietorship, but had shifted their holdings into an LLC, right? So some adapted, they left or came in, others learned. Now, here it's about a regulatory story, about evasion, code dodging. I'd like to talk about it. Some investors, yeah, sorry, please. Yes, of course, yeah.
Can you just explain the inactive, what that means?
Inactive here means that the investor was no longer buying property. They are no longer owning anything. There's no property associated with them in the record. Yeah, they are out of the population. They have essentially died as an investor. Okay, cool, thank you, yeah. No, because they're harmonized. If they stayed into an LLC, that means they switched to incorporated. They would go from red to green.
But what about LLCs that restructure? Different LLCs that are composed of the same actors.
They are resolved over time within the algorithm. So we would know that they are all one entity longitudinally. So we would have a longitudinal ID regardless of the structure in which they existed. Questions? All right, thank you. Okay, so adaptation, also evasion and learning. Again, 25% of these folks had switched to using an LLC. And I'm kind of curious, there's actually an idea that comes from the legal literature that a number of investors are now switching into LLCs because they're worried about risk to their investments, being sued for tenant liability and so on, that there's some kind of learning and professionalization going on in the structure. This is some of what Professor McElroy's work is about, new kinds of technologies and adaptation. And so I think this is what we're seeing also. I used some statistical models to investigate whether the initiation of code compliance investigations, 311 calls and so on, is related to a movement into investment vehicles. I'm worried about risk and learning. And I assessed this question in a panel of the rental properties that were directly held by their owners in 2010, and which never experienced an ownership transition over the period. In other words, they could have shifted into an LLC, but they were owned by the same person because we know that longitudinally. And what we found is that landlords who face complaints at one of their properties will place their unaffected properties into investment vehicles. It's anticipatory evasion is the story. If one is targeted, the rest of them will go in L2 LLC the subsequent year. It's a lot like tax evasion or asset evasion that goes on other kinds of sectors in the economy. And so it translates, at least in terms of the event history modeling, about a 15% increase in likelihood of property shifts into an investment vehicle for every complaint they receive, or a complaint made will be associated with a movement into an investment vehicle. The complaints being relevant here, right, because they trigger investigations by Austin Code, because they're concerned about property neglect, they're required to follow all of those different kinds of investigations, at least often, they do have the kind of capacity for doing that. In other words, when one property goes under investigation for neglect, the rest of the portfolio is likely to go dark, at least from the work I'm seeing now. And that's at least one aspect of it. Okay, so what are the implications? The following points here, I guess I'll make a follow. I think I've gone through the time pretty good. One is that the growth of corporate ownership that we're seeing may be highly overstated. Now, this is a study of one city, right? It's Austin, Texas. It doesn't explain everything. But at least from this, we can see reason to significantly doubt the story that we're getting about how this opacity is occurring. That being said, it's not that there isn't consolidation. There's something happening in the corporate world, but it seems primarily to be among very large entities. Those entities are consolidating, particularly in multifamily. So if we move from single family property to thinking about multifamily properties, in the rental space, those very large buildings, that's where amalgams of scale are increasing. At the level of small landlords, mom and pop ownership is pretty stable, right? This was a point also, comes back to Thomas Piketty, the petite rentiers have not gone away. They are still an essential feature of contemporary capitalism, so we have to think about them. But ownership structures are changing. The way that ownership is held is becoming more complex. There's new forms of entities, and there's more to it that I could go into, but there's all kinds of genealogical structures that exist in this data, fathers and sons and aunts owning properties together, putting properties into their names. There's all these other kinds of structures that exist within ownership. And so that is all proliferating and becoming complex. And arguably, this heavily undermines any kind of scale-based regulation, as like we're seeing here in Washington State, or at the national level, potentially with Trump. If you have 10 different properties and each of them is a different LLC, then you're going to be ending up regulating on the type of building, not the actual size of the owner, right? A 10-unit cap would only cover big buildings, not small buildings, because all of those small buildings are owned by different entities. So scale-based regulation is not necessarily maybe as effective. And then finally, theoretically, I think it's about this evolutionary perspective, right? Mergers, consolidation, adaptation, and evasion, or learning, I think, are contributing to an increasingly complex ownership environment. And so that's the story, I think, that comes from here in Austin. Corporate landlords are not taking over. Landlords as a whole seem to be evolving through consolidation, adaptation, and evasion of their holdings, through the use of these complex ownership structures. And this is producing the darkness or terra incognita of contemporary land. If you like phrases from occult phraseology, you might say, as above, so below. That is the dynamic that we're currently experiencing, right? So again, back to Seattle, all of these concerns exist here. We're doing all of the same things, right? We're also a city where we have all of this corporate ownership. What does this imply for us specifically? Well, I think that we're likely to see cohort replacement, evasion, and reinvestment. And we need to think about that, right? Small landlords might be pushed out of, for example, Seattle, but they're probably buying properties elsewhere, moving into the periphery. And small landlords are also probably likely using complex ownership structures that make regulation more difficult. The portfolios held by those 5 to 30 unit investors are particularly likely to escape regulation because they're not buying multifamily properties, but they're buying lots of smaller houses typically. And that's a very much larger share than REIT or private equity property in general. So that group is going to be missed. At the same time, I don't think that there's much understanding across the literature of the sheer degree of velocity in ownership turnover, the amount to which this is changing year to year, because real estate investing is, it's difficult, right? A lot of people go into it, they don't know what they're doing, there's a lack of professionalization, there's issues with profitability. People do this at demographic transitions when they're growing older and need money for retirement because they're unable to work, so they buy investment property and so on. This is a very highly volatile area of ownership. And I think that those processes of volatility are probably very important for understanding both how assets appreciate if they're changing hands, and also cycles of property neglect, right? If you have unprofessional investors who are constantly shifting properties amongst each other, that doesn't encourage long-term investment and so on. So the velocity is really important. And then I think that means, in terms of a regulation, that we need to focus in a different kind of framework. And I'm not quite exactly sure what that is, but I think we need to think less about regulating scale or taxonomies, but probably trying to regulate what I would say is time and space. You want to regulate particular places, and you want to regulate the speed of the investment cycle. I think that's where I would go, not necessarily targeting mom and pops or corporate landlords. Again, some evidence here of similar dynamics here. These are people who have said they're stop renting here in King County or in Seattle. They were surveyed by the city auditor. 41% of them said they bought something elsewhere if they're regulating out of the city. So people who are facing regulations are going to move. They're going to adapt. And so we have to think about that when we think about people who are renting. And just a little bit more about the current status of the law here in corporate investment. I don't think that this in any way, this is the language in SB 5496. I don't think it really addresses these kinds of problems. It's 25 single family homes. The business entity definitions are not quite working well. And so I think we're just going to miss a lot in this kind of approach. Okay, so what might be helpful regulatory approaches? What can we actually do about this problem? I think I have a little bit more time here. First of all, I think that LLC transparency acts might be particularly useful. The first one passed, a very imperfect law, but the first one passed in New York State 2 years ago. I had a conversation with Emily Gallagher's office, and so I had some feelings and thoughts about that. Unfortunately, in the form in which it passed, there are problems that I can talk about, but it represents a kind of model in which we can do things, which I'll get into in a moment. The LLC Transparency Acts are part of a broader shift across the US, right? We now have a Corporate Transparency Act which would allow us to actually understand ownership. It mandates the reporting of beneficial owners among all corporate forms. A beneficial owner being someone who directly or indirectly, through any contract, arrangement, or understanding of any otherwise, exercises substantial control of the reporting company, right? So we would get through a lot of these problems. There are issues with this. One, it's not public. You need the equivalent of a warrant to obtain this data. They were started under the Biden administration. And secondly, the Trump administration is no longer enforcing it. So we don't have access to this particular law. This data is not being collected, and it wasn't really useful. I will also say that a large part of the motivation for the law was not problems among domestic investors, right? It was largely fears of Russian and Chinese investors. It was directed at people who were outside of the US. I had a conversation with Gallagher's office, and I said that I don't think that's very likely dominant in the dynamic. But that is nonetheless the understanding of what's happening now. Unfortunately, this also occurred with LLC Transparency Act. The first version of it was vetoed by Hochul's office. Now it only requires reporting among foreign investors, Chinese and Russian oligarchs and so on, who they're concerned about. And so it's limited to a relatively small portion of the population, but I don't think it's dominant. I think the majority of investors are likely domestic. I can talk about that data in Austin. No one who I've spoken to in any other city has found that to be the case. And again, it's not publicly accessible. So we don't have access to this data that we can use for many different kinds of things. So we think about transparency. There are legal doctrines which also might help us think through what we can do. We can do common control liability. This is advocated by James Horner. Even if two different entities are owned under different structures, if we can determine that they are owned by the same beneficiary, then we do have the legal strategies through common control liability to enforce that under the Employee Retirement Income Security Act. Actually, this is a different interpretation of the law. But even though LLCs and other things separate liability, if we're concerned, for example, about neglect, investment, and so on, there are legal strategies that different jurisdictions could pursue to get through this, even though it's not recognized by contemporary code. And again, a little bit more nitty gritty here, but again, a lot of the stuff among small investors is concerned about maintaining them, about neglect, about property mismanagement. I think that there are different ways that if we're concerned about that problem related to all of this, that we can do something about it. The city of Philadelphia has offered a rental improvement program for small investors. They kind of work on particular issues for small landlords in exchange to not raise rents. There's different kinds of things investors could do. They're not perfect solutions, obviously, but some of these more acute problems are associated with their corporate ownership. I think that could solve some problems. And so I think with that, I have my talk said, and I'm looking forward to all of your questions. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I'll put it on my.
Sure, we're here, yeah.
When you increase the opacity, and there's kind of this, I feel like there's this class transition things that happen where you're owning one property, you make is maybe only a little bit more money than the people you're renting to. As you start to become a bigger fish, you get into kind of a class warfare vibe with them, when now you have a lot more. You're not as willing to give me your phone number and say, oh, my bathroom is leaking this, so and so. What does that look like for renters? And does that opacity come with, oh, now I got a property manager, now you got to send me an email, now you got to go through this repair service you can't in my home like you used to. What is the ground reality for renters? And is it worse if I go from 1 to 5 unit landlord to an LLC?
Yeah, I think that that's a great question. Thank you. So I think I need to repeat the question. To summarize, what is the consequence of a transition in opacity? And what does that mean for the tenant? And I think I would say a couple of things. I think opacity is more of a collective problem of the environment. It's a problem of the environment. I don't necessarily know that opacity from the perspective of the tenant is always necessarily the issue that they're confronting. Maybe, depending on the case, but I think that we have to think about it. So for example, if you have a small owner who is trying to go larger, a lot of their problems are going to be with revenue. for income, the ability to maintain their management. And so if there's some sort of transition to a more opaque structure, does that impact the tenant? I'm not always necessarily sure that it would. If they're overly financial burdened because they're trying to grow larger, because they're trying to do something else, because they're in debt, that would probably be the mechanism, but opacity, I'm not sure would directly translate into that. That being said, if we're thinking about like a lot of properties that have just been bought by a different kind of owner who has now an LLC structure, that makes it more difficult at a large multifamily property to organize around that particular issue and hold them accountable. So point being, I think like it's very context dependent whether opacity is specifically the mechanism, and I think we need more empirical research on that. I will say there is some research that suggests that just having an LLC makes you more likely to neglect property because it's a mechanism, but the research is very divided on whether that's the case or whether that actually is the case. It might be more simply that people are more likely to buy properties that are difficult to manage, that are in low status with an LLC. For example, they go in and I'm saying, this is an already deteriorating property. I'm going to use LLC to protect myself. And because it's already deteriorated, you know what I mean? So the causal arrow can go in multiple different directions. It's an open question. Yeah, but I think for me, the problem of opacity is that it overall, in general, collectively makes it hard to understand and regulate all of it. I think that's the collective problem. And there's also the kind of organizing problem too for those properties. So yeah, I think that's how I think about it. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, sure, Patrick.
Thanks for your attention. Super interesting. I want to go back to like so then if there's no chance that there's no transition to LLCs and corporate ownership. I was wondering if you could, I don't know a ton about this area, distinguish between parcels, units, and buildings.
Yeah.
When you're doing that. And
Yeah.
so I'm curious, like maybe if you look at the parcel levels, you think you might see some of this like corporate conglomeration, right? Where we're seeing more and more parcels being bought up by large LLCs, and they're building multifamily cities, but single family homes in the same.
So yeah, in terms, so is the question is whether if we shifted the unit analysis to properties rather than units, would that shift our understanding?
Yeah, and you might have done that already. So that's why
yeah.
I was asking how the difference between parcels.
Yeah, if we shift to properties, corporate ownership looks even smaller, much smaller, because you're essentially treating each property as the same. And so then it would be 95% are owned by very small. The units accounts for the fact that some of those properties, those parcels are bigger, much bigger. So in that sense, yeah.
If you were to sound like, so there's no transition and not, like, I know it's primarily small landholders, but it's not so stable.
Yeah, yeah, in general, the transition across the board in terms of that is that it's relatively stable. There's a certain, I mean, well, at least in Austin, there's more dense multifamily properties being built, right? But the vast majority are these, in the United States, these smaller kinds of structures. So that's at that level. But I apologize for the problem, but this is necessarily the problem of the field. There's so many different kinds of things: corporate, LLC, parcel, unit. The way in which we measure creates all these sort of distinctions. And I think that's all something that we're wrestling with, that even the terminology is difficult. Yeah, thank you. Was there a question, I think, in the back here? Brandon, perhaps, yeah?
How is trends affecting consolidation and prices and investment patterns within cities? We can see any stable.
So I'm working on rent right now for Austin and rental dynamics. I think the preview for that research is that there's an assumption from neoclassical economics, right? This abundance paradigm of direct market competition and filtering among large property owners. So you should see new property lowering, for example, the existing rents. I think that a sociological explanation is there's a lot of anchoring. There's actually price anchoring among properties, and particularly among larger owners. When new owners come in, they're going to be anchoring their rents to the existing rents, also because of technology, right? We have real paid and all these different kinds of means. So when you have more consolidation, that's going to mean that there's more anchoring among rents and they're less fluctuating and they're going higher. I think that the ownership trend might suggest an upward pressure on rents. Now, not maybe forever, right? It's going to be, there's cycles in the business cycle. Austin rents have gone down recently because of a lot of dynamics. But during the period of consolidation, when they're actually building, that can generate spikes potentially. So I think that's going to shape how the anchoring prices are set. Absolutely. Thank you. Yeah, over here. Yeah.
Thanks. I'm gonna stop. I'm really fascinated.
Yeah.
I was wondering, getting back a little bit to the opacity as sort of problematic for tenant organizing. I was wondering if you had a chance to look at all our else as is there any evidence that tenant organizing or the passage of tenant protections also triggers sort of that transition to LLCs or more complex structures? I'm wondering if there's maybe a feedback that isn't there.
Yeah, in terms of the conflict over particular properties.
Or like maybe in the area, if there's a lot of, if it's a more tenant protected, there's a lot of regulations around protections are more like, I'm thinking about like DC, there are a lot of tenant protections relatively. Does that actually trigger?
I would love to do that research. I think that's the next project. If we can do one city, do comparative, right? If regulation actually produces evasion and threat, then we look across cities. I'm trying to do that with Seattle. So right now we're collecting data this last summer. That would be where we would go. I don't know. There might be some folks who are familiar with that more recent research. I don't know that we know it yet, or that there's a lot of empirical research. I mean, capital flight is real. And so I could see that happening. But again, there's lots of other kinds of processes that are in place. I'm not really sure. Yeah. Okay, Juan?
Rich presentation. Sparks a lot of things in my brain. I'm gonna throw out a couple of things that I've connected, and I'm curious how you will respond.
Sure, thank you.
So it's not really a fully formed question, but you started off talking about you have to map the land in order to conquer the land, plan and imperialism. And I thought that was what an interesting end to the conversation. And then we came back around when we were talking about interstate relations, especially in terms of land being bought by I guess, is it people or entities from China and Russia?
Well, this is a narrative, but I think that there a lot of the narrative that went into these LLC transparency acts is there are oligarchs in Russia or Chinese investors. That's the
And immediately my thought was about the proposal to give individuals $100,000 in Greenland to have access to their land, and then imagine conversation with the golden passport in which people can access through money the ability to gain citizenship and therefore not only to reside on land but also to own land and property. So I'm just making these connections based on what you're saying. I'm curious. I don't know, do these streams of thought fit well with the ways in which we're theorizing ownership and nationalism? I mean, like what?
Yeah.
They're not clear connections in my mind, but I'm seeing surprising overlaps, I guess.
Well, there's a lot, there's so many, this is such a rich conversation. There's so many angles we can take with that. The thrust of, I think what I'm doing here is that people are entering with legal entities and other people into more complex structures, which creates new types of entities that aren't just people, right? And so if we think about citizenship is being accessed through these complex entities that are obscure. So people can acquire citizenship through some other means, and that makes them property owners, right? That makes them citizens, that makes them parts of that community. So I think I would emphasize the evolution of this structure that are things that aren't quite easily recognizable as human, right? And so that's
Where you're taking this for me is that it's the distinction of insider outsider is mostly tied to class and money. hierarchies that we're maybe more used to talking about citizenship and territory, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. No, yeah, we're just at the tip of the iceberg because we don't know. So there's a billion things we could ask exactly in that area. Yeah, thanks. Sure, yeah.
My question online, and I'm a little bit. My question online is there been a lead data set affinities that you've created to other information on landmarks like demographics or condition of units?
Have I linked? The question is, have I linked this data?
Or could one?
Yes, one could link one. With sufficient time, could we link this data? That's my life. Yes, that's my data. What I will say is that there are many different models for doing this. So for example, one could do the eviction lab model. We could have a central repository. We could try to bring all the researchers together across the US. We could try to build one center. Another way is to do a diffuse and distributed model where there are many different centers and different groups of collaborators working on different communities that are invested in those communities that are doing the long-term research of linking. I would be an advocate of the second approach. And I will say that I'm not the only one in this field, right? Of course, the work that Aaron McElroy has been doing, mapping ownership has been going on for a very long time. And so I'm not going to say that I've done all of this. I have this one study of this particular place that's longitudinal, and that's unique. But a lot of people have been doing this work, and they've been doing it with activists. They've been doing it with communities. They've been doing it with tenant advocates in different places. And so I don't want to displace all of that work. So there's lots of folks in different regions who have that experience, that localized knowledge to do all of this together. And I think we should encourage everyone in the community that they're in to work together to do all of that linkages. And so this is the first maybe longitudinal publication of this kind of solution, but it's not, I'm not the only one doing it. It's a broad community of many people fighting many different collective problems with many different intellectual perspectives. And so we're all part of that too. Yeah. Yeah, sure. Yeah.
So my question is methods, but there's substantive reason I'm asking, and we were talking about organizing and how the LLC application is kind of disrupted, at least in some cases, the labor work as well. But I also know that on the ground, there's been kind of this new realization and talking between different communities, realizing that LLCs exist across cities. And so now, for the first time, we're hearing stories of multi-building, multi-city team organizing against LLC. So my question is, when you're doing the methods that link all of the elements together, is that like a mathematical model or a graph model, or is it a statistical model where we're estimating these relationships? And if so, even if LLCs are changing names, like is that model something that can be used to potentially identify owners across places to use in tenant organizing to have bigger people, and are we using it to maybe suss out who these people are? Even if we don't know their names, we know that this LLC looks like this LLC.
Yeah, so there's intellectual and political debates here and lots of ethical considerations also in terms of, I'm sorry. I think the question that I've been asked is, could this be used in the service of organizing? And could we do this to look across different kinds of communities, right, across different kinds of cities? There are some folks, so the answer to the first part, there are some folks who are starting to think, so systems are always defined by their boundary. So this is a city as a system. We could do multi-city systems. We would need many people doing that, but we could do it. That's an intellectual project with a particular problem. It would require different people to think about that for a goal. It would require researchers working with tenant advocates to do that, but it's possible. And the tools here are graph models that they're not probabilistic, they're deterministic, so they could directly identify the owners, and we could do that. Many different kinds of procedures are available. This is one such approach. People could replicate my methods. There's other folks, you could replicate the work that McElroy's team has been doing. You could replicate the work that Forrest Engine has done. His code is online. There's other approaches. That being said, there's different philosophies. One set of philosophies is what we're looking for people, right? We want to see the big bad. Who's the villain? Others are, like me, what's the organization? There's different kinds of philosophies. And then there's, of course, the ethical and political reality of, should I publish people's names online? and be publicly responsible for that. We all have different positions. I think that mine is not necessarily one where I'm going to be doing that kind of work, but other folks might. So it's a broader ecosystem. Yeah. Yeah. Are there other questions over here? Yeah, Adam. Yeah.
I'd like to build on the logical question. So if I understand correctly, one of the challenges that you address is identifying this latent construct that the owner known as community ownership. The question is, if you could offer some anecdotes into how maybe you validated that work properly, or the implications for maybe misidentifying nodes that are out there.
Yeah, so that's an excellent question. And this is an active field of research. We don't have a registry that we can compare this against, so we're working in the unknown. You can do a couple of things. You can compare it to SEC filings. If you look at the largest owners in SEC filings and data from CoStar, for example, a business repository, and compare it against mine, you can see certain kinds of things. This is comparing it with CoStar's data. It's a proprietary thing. They only look at multifamily properties. They don't look at everything. But generally speaking, the largest landlords they find are the largest landlords I find, like at least 12 of the time. So you can say, oh, okay, we're getting a rough approximation with what private data is out there. The largest landlord I find in terms of people in Austin is a guy named Jimmy Nestor. And Jimmy is known. He's a known investor. You can look at him in the news. So that's a kind of rough approximation. You can use media content. So we find that it's generally this patient case. We have the SEC filings. You can compare it to actually what's registered and reported. So American Homes for Rent does have registry report. They said that there were 358 358 properties in Austin in 2021 that they owned. We can get that from the data. We can compare it to like what I'm finding. And if I look at Travis County, Williamson, Hayes with those data expanding, I see 939, so that's recalled 97%. So, you can guess. There's not total measures, but we can create a couple of things to increase our sense of the robustness. Yeah, of course, thanks. Okay, yeah.
I'm really curious about what is happening. Story seems to be that mom and pop are still there, but now mom and pop into your corporation. How do you react there? We talk about this idea of like regulatory threats. Why can't mom and pop even see themselves as a business and like move forward? Like how are really small landlords learning to do this?
Yeah. Very interesting. Yeah, very, very interesting question. I think about risk and survival, because we all have theoretical perspectives, and so I'm thinking about this in evolutionary terms. They're adapting to threats. Can they survive in this market? Regulations are now you have Mamdani, right? So for example, there's other people who are now much more aggressively interested in regulation, the Trump administration, whatever. I think that in that context, as well as real problems of affordability, there is a kind of evolutionary pressure to use new tools to survive in that system if you want to do it. And so I think that's kind of the framework I would approach this with. Another framework is that, there's the cultural discourse, right? There's all of the online media, there's all of the, there's a whole other framework of real estate investment forms and new technology to diffuse these things. You can go onto ChatGPT and it can tell you how to invest your properties, right? There's a technological level as well. So we could all think about learning in that sense too. So yeah, thank you. Okay.
That brings us to time. Thank you so much. And join us next time for a panel on violence, gun violence, and domestic violence. Robert Poster. Thank you.